Hello, I'm Paul Washington, Executive Director of the ESG Center here at the Conference Board. The crises of 2020 have had a profound effect on all of us, individually and collectively. They've exposed fundamental problems in our society and vulnerabilities in our systems. They've also brought to light, however, a new resilience, a sense of urgency in addressing longstanding problems, and a desire not to go back to what we had before, but to build it back better. Perhaps more than ever before, public corporations in the United States find themselves at the center of addressing profound economic, social, and environmental issues. And that's caused many of us to reconsider the very role of a corporation in society today. As the world's leading nonprofit think tank devoted to serving business and society for over a century, the Conference Board is working to help companies define and fulfill their evolving role and to find reasoned solutions to the challenges confronting us all. As part of that effort, the Conference Board is proud to present a series of discussions with leaders on building a more civil and just society. Today, our focus is on the role of corporations in society, and I am really thrilled to be joined by Darren Walker, who's president of the Ford Foundation, a $13 billion international social justice philanthropy. A little bit about Darren, whose life is kind of legendary. Before he joined Ford, Darren was vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation, overseeing global and domestic programs. In the 1990s, he was chief operating officer of the Abyssinian Development Corporation, a famed organization and Harlem's largest community development organization. His list of civic and cultural accomplishments and activities is truly remarkable. He is a member of Governor Cuomo's Reimagining New York Commission, co-chair of the New York City Census 2020. He's co-chair of New York City's Mayoral Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers. He also chaired the philanthropy committee that brought a resolution to the city of Detroit's historic bankruptcy, and he co-founded both the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance and the President's Council on Disability Inclusion in Philanthropy. He serves on many nonprofit boards, from the Lincoln Center for Performing Arts to the National Gallery of Art to the Committee to Protect Journalists and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. No stranger to the corporate world, Darren began his career on Wall Street and has served on a number of prominent public company boards. Most recently, he was appointed to the boards of Square and Ralph Lauren. His personal story is also an inspiring reminder of the opportunity that America can offer. Educated exclusively at public schools, Darren was a member of the first Head Start class in 1965 and received a BA, BS, and JD degree from the University of Texas at Austin. And today, Darren joins us as the recipient of 16 honorary degrees and university awards, including Harvard's W.B. Du Bois Medal. We could have just eaten up the entire webcast with an introduction, and there's more I could have said. So Darren, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. It's a huge honor for me to be here. I'm grateful for the invitation.
Great. So let's get started. About a year ago, the Business Roundtable got a lot of press attention, I think more than they expected, when 181 CEOs signed a statement on the purpose of a corporation. Curiously, the statement actually doesn't define a purpose of a corporation. It leaves it up to each company to do so. But it does talk about the commitments that a company and the signatories were making to customers, to employees, to investors, to suppliers, and others. I know when the statement came out, there was a nice quote from you saying nice things about the statement. I wonder what you thought about the statement then and how you look at it now.
Well, I really appreciated that Alex Gorski and Jamie Dimon and the other leaders of the BRT who were involved with drafting that reached out and consulted with many people, including myself. And what I appreciated about it, and my advice to them, was to explicitly reject the Milton Friedman idea of the role of the corporation singularly to return investment to a return on the investment of shareholders as the primary purpose. and they explicitly adopted a stakeholder
Mm-hmm.
approach, a different paradigm. I think that was significant. The challenge is that there have not been the concrete measures that demonstrate the commitment to actually implementing a stakeholder paradigm. We've yet to see that strategy come forward.
Right. And I think now there's probably greater urgency than ever before in doing that. But let's talk a little bit. You know, you've, as I mentioned, you started your career in Wall Street a while back, and then you've served on these public company boards. I'm curious, you know, pre-COVID, how had you seen during your, you know, your career, the role of a public company evolve? I talked to Dick Parsons about this, and you know, it seems as if some companies all along the way have sort of seen that they had a broader public purpose. Others went through periods of moments where they were just purely stockholder focused. So I'm just wondering, just in general, how have you seen, how did you see the role of a public company evolve over time before we got to the current crises?
I think in the BC world, I felt that corporations could help contribute to solving society's challenges, that companies actually can provide opportunities for solutions while doing good. And I've always felt that way, and the very best companies, I think, delivered on that idea.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I've always felt that way. My experience, however, with the reality of being in the belly of the beast, if you will, it is hard when you are a public company director to witness some of the things that we see in the name of shareholder activism, which has done tremendous harm, I believe, to many, many companies, and has, I think, destroyed value, long-term value of many, many companies. And I remember, you know, when Indra Nooyi took the action to move PepsiCo towards a healthier portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
There were analysts, people who covered the company who said no.
Mm-hmm.
Making sweetened products is where the money is,
Mm-hmm.
and so keep making sweetened products. And Indra was courageous and said, we have to invest. We have to expend the capital. And as you know, that question of capital allocation is the key issue. And I was so inspired because Indra said we've got to allocate capital to make acquisitions of healthier portfolio companies. And that was a big move. But again, the incentives were really against her. And,
Yeah.
and those incentives and often those who argued against her said, we're arguing in favor of the shareholder. And yes, it may have benefited the shareholder short term, but Indra was making the case for the long-term value proposition of the company.
Right. And that just highlights the real challenge. You can have a well-intentioned CEO, a great plan, a board that's on board with it, but there are these systemic pressures, right, that drag you back sometimes from having that broader sense of purpose and mission, and adjusting your business in a way that probably makes sense in the long run, right? But it can be a real uphill struggle. So I guess one thing you're highlighting is it's hard as a company's redefining its own role. Maybe you can't do it in isolation. You can't do it without having your investors on board. And frankly, not doing it on your own, it helps if others in the industry are doing it as well, I guess, right?
No, absolutely. But I think it also speaks to the challenge of activism because um, I think an activist investor often is a different kind of investor. And I think those investors who are with the company long term, who are committed to see the growth of the company over time, are the most valuable investors because they will give the CEO and management the space to innovate, to be creative, and to do good for the company over the long term.
Yeah. And that requires a degree of effort, I think, on management's part to sort of lay out, here is our plan. I know of one pharma company that said basically, shareholders, we're sorry, but you're going to not get market returns, what you want, for about the next 10 years. But they said, here's what we're planning to do. These are the markers. And at the end of the 10 years, actually the company vastly outperformed anyone else. But it's a challenge to have that long-term plan, to convey it, to have hopefully your base of long-term investors on board with you. So I'm wondering, so those are big challenges even before we've faced these multiple crises, the health, economic, social crisis that we're dealing with now. And I'm wondering if what your view is on, have these crises just heightened the attention to the role of a company in society? Have they somehow shifted the role of the company in society? I'm just wondering what you think the impact of them has been.
Well, I think the pandemic has had a tremendous impact on companies. Obviously, in a consumer economy, when consumers, for the most part, are not as engaged. When consumers feel more economically vulnerable, they are less likely to spend, and therefore we see more bankruptcies, more downgrades in credit, et cetera. But what has fundamentally changed, Paul, is not the pandemic. What has fundamentally changed companies and their behavior and the management outlook is the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that we are seeing in American society today. And this has manifest for the first time in features of a company that a CEO has never really had to deal with. One, African-American employees and other employees who are outraged, angered, grief-stricken, and very unhappy about the state of race relations, the state of systemic racism in our society and in their companies. And I think what has challenged many CEOs is sitting through town halls, meetings with the Black employee resource groups, the kinds of encounters that they have never had before with African-American employees and other employees saying, this happens in the workplace, at our company, at the water cooler, in the cafeteria, in my review. Racism is prevalent in this company. That's what CEOs are hearing in a way they have never heard before, because those African-American and other employees are more motivated to speak up and speak out as a result of the murder of George Floyd and the other African-Americans in the weeks before who were also killed. That has changed. The other thing that has changed is the growing awareness in society around structural and systemic racism. The polling indicates that a majority of Americans today believe that racism is a problem in American society. We have never had polling numbers that reflect that. And so customers, suppliers, people in the communities where we work and where companies do business are asking them, how are you addressing this issue of systemic racism? What are you doing about it? And that's really changing the paradigm. I listened to two earnings calls. There was literally an earnings call of a Fortune 500 company that I listened to, and I know this happened with others, where the CEO opened the call talking about systemic racism, both in the United States and the challenges within his company. And there were questions from the analysts covering the company about what are you doing about diversity in your company. I have never been on an earnings call and had questions come into the CEO about diversity and race. This is a fundamental shift in what we are seeing. And I think we're going to see, as investors like BlackRock step forward and speak out about these issues, as Larry Fink has been doing, and other asset managers, I think we're going to see some fundamental shifts in the behavior of corporate America.
Yeah, we could stop the interview right there, because I think that's such an important set of points. And we've heard this from our members too, that companies are having what are called courageous conversations. You can also call them overdue conversations about race in a way that they just never have before. And heads of HR departments and general counsels who probably resisted holding those conversations in the past because they were scared about liability and so forth, they've now actually turned to start to facilitate those conversations and say, okay, what can we do to actually, to make sure that we can have these discussions, and we'll mitigate the litigation risk, but we need to have these conversations. That's more important. And you're right, it was a big deal when investor analysts started to ask even a couple questions about an environmental or social or governance issue, but to have them actually ask it. It's one thing for the CEO to have the script and to talk about race, opening it up, but actually to have investment analysts who otherwise might be very focused on plugging in the latest number in their model so they can predict your earnings per share 5 years out, are now asking about race. That is truly a profound shift. So what would you suggest that companies do to take this moment and move beyond those courageous conversations internally and beyond the discussion with investors to sort of make the systemic and sustainable changes to address racial injustice and inequality, among other challenges? But really, that's at the core. What can companies realistically and aspirationally do?
Well, this takes us back to the BRT pledge and what needs to follow on. In this regard, I think we need specific goals and targets, starting with the board. So as you may know, we have some 170 to 90, depending on how you count, S&P 500 companies without an African-American board member.
Yeah.
These are companies that sell products to, engage with the African-American community, make money off of the African-American community, and there's no representation on their boards. I think this needs to be addressed, and I think companies need to make commitments to do that. I think as we look at the leadership teams, again, the number of large public companies that do not have an African American in the C-suite on the operating committee is shocking and disappointing. I think we have to make commitments there. That's the hard work. Where companies immediately go is, we're going to expand our recruitment and go to HBCUs. We're going to have more summer internships that are paid, and that's the easy work.
Right.
Yes, it's important and necessary, but that's the easy work. The hard work is to address the centers of power and decision-making and authority in companies and commit to putting Black people in those spaces and places. And until that happens, we are not going to see the kind of moves which take us beyond what companies have done, which is, for the most part, not all, but for the most part, tokenism. We need to move from tokenism to transformation in corporate America. And in order for that to happen, we're going to need courageous leaders who take intentional action with real numbers attached, and that people are held accountable to deliver on those numbers, just as they deliver on all other sorts of KPIs. Right. Here's the chance to do something that is going to transform the company and make the company better, make us more profitable, make us represent the communities we serve and who are our customers, and have a workforce that is more diverse and more happy and satisfied with their jobs.
Right. And as you're talking about moving beyond tokenism, and look, it can be, what may have been happening is quite well-meaning. Okay, we need some more diversity on the board, but often what can be is, can happen is okay, we've got X number of women, we have X number of people of color, we're done, right? So that somehow, because even investors have sort of said, okay, do you have some diversity on your board? And they're kind of satisfied. If it's okay, 25% of the board is female and 20% is people of color. Okay, that company's good. But I think what you're talking about is not being satisfied. Now, first of all, you got to get there, right? But it's also not being satisfied so that somehow you've just checked that box, because this is transformational. But this is not about just simply satisfying some threshold, right?
Well, Paul, I'm on 2 nominating and governance committees of the boards I'm a member of, and I find it so interesting. We spend a tremendous amount of time talking about the assets, the capacities, capabilities we need around the board table to support management, to be a center of excellence, of knowledge and wisdom, so that the company will benefit from our presence. One of the things that is really clear today is that many companies do not have the assets, the capabilities that diversity would benefit them right now. They would not be so flat-footed to be working their way through and navigating through. I mean, I will tell you the number of CEOs who have called me to ask for advice, or I've done town halls with CEOs who don't have a Black board member.
Yeah.
And because I know them and I know their intentions, I'm happy to join them in a town hall. But I think it would be much better. And I know I've done town halls and the boards I'm on. And this question comes up. The diversity question always comes up from the staff. And I know that in addition to what I might know about sustainability and ESG,
Yeah.
the fact that I'm a Black queer man gives me insights and perspectives that can benefit the board, especially during times like this.
Yeah. No, and I think you've touched on a couple of things there. One is that there is an evolving role for a board member. Boards, they decide things, they oversee things, they advise things, and increasingly boards can engage. They can engage with shareholders and they can engage with employees. And what you're doing at companies is really important, I think. It sends an important signal, but it's also an important vehicle for two-way communication between employees and the boards directly. So I think that's something that's important. You also pointed out that you serve on nominating governance committees, and that's also important to make sure that there's a diversity on the board and on that committee to have broader perspectives. And finally, you talked about, and I think this is really important too, that when you're out looking for directors, you need to open up your aperture and say, are we looking at the board as a strategic asset? Right? Not just a compliance thing, not just, okay, people we know who won't rock the boat. Most companies don't do that. But, are we really looking at a strategic asset that's going to help the company navigate an increasingly multicultural, multidimensional world? So I think that your suggestions there are spot on. And I'm wondering, so that's with the board. I'm wondering with a couple of questions, maybe combine them. So other than making sure you've got diversity on your board and that it's an ingrained part of your process, and frankly, diversity in your senior management, because we know that a lot of decisions are just made by management, which they should be. Do you have diversity there? What sort of things do you think what's your advice for a CEO on what they should be focusing on? And in particular, what would your advice be for an African American CEO who, historically, sometimes folks didn't feel like they could speak up because it seemed self-serving. And I'm just wondering about your advice for CEOs in general and for African American CEOs who are interested in addressing issues of racial injustice and inequality.
Well, I think CEOs generally have to hold themselves and their teams accountable to deliver, to establish clear KPIs and hold their folks accountable for execution and delivery. I think the CEO has to speak not only to employees, but to other stakeholders in the company, and increasingly the public, because the private sector has an inordinate amount of power and influence in American society and beyond. And so it is important to understand that when you are a CEO today of a public company, you are not just the leader of a business with X number of employees and X number of shareholders. You serve in a public benefit kind of way. And there is an expectation from the public that you speak to and answer to the question of what benefit are you bringing the public? Because at the end of the day, corporations exist and are allowed to exist because the public permits it to exist. And so I do think that there is an important public role to play. I would also add, Paul, I've been in a lot of conversations about public companies, but it's important to remember that something has fundamentally changed in corporate America. And that is that we have fewer public companies today than we did 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. And when we talk about companies, it's always public companies, because actually the public and policymakers don't fully understand what has happened in corporate America. And so private equity and privately held companies employ millions of people, wield significant power and influence, and the firms that invest in them are hugely outsized in their power in the marketplace. And yet, there is no engagement on these questions of accountability. And that's by design, but I think that's a real problem. And I think in some ways it's unfair to place the burden and the opportunity in this time, in this space, solely on publicly held companies.
So is your answer any different when talking to an African-American CEO?
I think African-American CEOs and African-American leaders in this country of primarily white institutions are particularly and uniquely challenged. And that is, you as an African-American bring with you a legacy and a history of your own lived experience, which is certainly characterized in this country by discrimination, by facing bigotry at some point in your life. And that is with you. And there is also a concern from whites that you will serve African Americans. I mean, look at what happened with President Obama. One of the reasons President Obama, in my view, was initially in his first term not as aggressive on issues of race is because his pollsters told him that suburban white Americans were concerned that he would be too focused on Black issues and issues of race and not issues that mattered to them. And so he held back. And I find that Black leaders are often faced with this challenge of white stakeholders having a view that they might favor the interests of African Americans at their expense. I think this has changed. And it's changed in part because of this year and the racial reckoning that we're seeing in this country, where I believe so many white Americans were shocked and heartbroken by what happened in Minneapolis and before. And that heartbreak has, I think, been transformed into real action, which is so necessary and so needed, because while white Americans in recent months have been heartbroken by racism in America, African Americans have been heartbroken for over 4 centuries because of racism in America. And I think at last, we all now know racism is no longer deniable. Deniability is no longer an option. And the work that we need to do to reconcile and heal this country is now underway. And corporate America has a critical role to play.
Yeah, I'm thinking as you're talking that is, these broken hearts have actually become open hearts. And people are more receptive to addressing and feeling these issues and feeling empathy in ways that wasn't really even permissible in some ways, or just generally acceptable 5 or 10 years ago. And that's a profound transformation. And I think one thing you also talked about is there's this role of a public company, or of a company, you've got a measure of public trust. Any kind of company is a steward of some measure of public trust. And that means, the companies, as they're thinking about their transformation, is, do they have the right people on the board? Do they have the right people in the C-suite to to lead an institution that carries that measure of public trust? Do they have the right people within an organization and organizational structures within the company to not just be making money, but to serve this public purpose? And do they have the right compensation schemes that actually reinforce all of that? So there may be a pivotal moment here for companies, public and private, to think about all of that. What is our purpose? What are our roles? Do we have the right people? Do we have the right structures? Do we have the right compensation that supports our broader mission, as well as the requirement to make money in the long term? So that's a big ticket to fill. And I'm sort of wondering, you wrote this wonderful piece recently for the New York Times, and you ended on a note of hope there, and on the importance of hope. And I'm wondering what gives you hope right now, that corporate America may be able to rise to the challenges we're talking about.
Hope has been very important for me in my own life. Hope and optimism are at the center of the American narrative. And when I became president of Ford, one of the things we did was to really transform our work around the issue of inequality. And
Mm-hmm.
some people said, why inequality? Inequality correlates with hope. Where there is more inequality, there is less hope. Where there is more equality, there is more hope. And so I believe that hope is the oxygen of a democracy. And in a capitalist, democratic society, the role of the company, the role of the firm is so critical to that narrative and to the idea of hope and the aspirations that come from optimism and a belief in the future. And so corporations, firms have a critical role to play in providing the opportunity for people to work, to have a livelihood, to have status. And a society like America, work is so embedded in our own identity, our own self-worth. And so we need companies with ideas, products, enterprise, and of course we need government, which has a role to play in policy, in rule setting, and we need the courts.
Yeah.
So that's it's that the alchemy that comes from that makes it possible for America to be America. But my concern, Paul, is that we have had an economy that has produced far too little opportunity and provided people like me with too much opportunity ultimately. And so we live in a society with too much inequality, where some of us have actually almost hoarded opportunity. And we hoarders now need to recognize that it's not about what can I give back, as Andrew Carnegie said, but what can I give up? And what will I need to give up so that the America that we all want to live in can be experienced by more of us? There are far too many people who feel left out and left behind by an economy that has marginalized them. And if we don't take corrective action, and companies have a critical role to play here, we are going to lose America. We're going to lose this idea of a special place, a place that is unprecedented in history, a place that brought together people from all walks of life, from all around the globe, to make a country, to make a democracy, and to live with prosperity and harmony. That ideal is still with us because America is not just a nation.
Mm-hmm.
America is an idea, and that idea is under threat. Corporations can play a role in helping to get America back on track to being America.
Yeah. And I think what you've said about whatever a company might produce for the marketplace, whatever it might do, part of it is it provides the oxygen of hope. And that's something that I think is really important for corporate boards and CEOs to keep in mind, that they are part, whatever else they make hope.
That's right.
And
I like to say this, at the Ford Foundation, I say we are in the business of hope.
Yeah.
And during a time of hopelessness, there is no better business to be in. And I would say the same thing for many of our companies.
Yeah.
But they don't talk about themselves.
No, they don't. Although, I worked with Dick Parsons for 20, 30 years on and off. And one of the things that was great, and he went through everything you could go through that was negative, as whether it was the SNL crisis, the aftermath of the all-time war.
Gosh, all the way to the end with Carl
Citi,
Icahn.
and then chair of Citi in the financial crisis, all that kind of stuff. But what he did as a leader, and it enabled us as organizations, was he personified and emanated that sense. It wasn't just confidence, because that's kind of, that can be positive and negative, right? But it was that sense of hope. So it's different from confidence. It's different from optimism. And I think that if you have that sense of hope coming from your leadership, so as we think about diversity and all that, it's almost that disposition toward hope, that if you can have it infused within an organization, and then you behave in ways that help to create more hope for people, which involves creating greater economic opportunity and so forth. That's a really profound opportunity for companies, and something for everyone to think about when they're choosing their CEOs and when they're choosing board members and senior executives and others. Are these people going to be the sort of people who can actually understand that role of a company in creating hope and can execute on it? Yeah.
Indeed.
So look, Darren, this has been really fascinating, and I am so grateful that you've taken the time out from what is an incredibly busy schedule to spend it with us to talk about these issues that really matter, not just to public companies, but that matter to the future of our society. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Paul, for the invitation. It's been a great honor.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you all for watching today. And I'd encourage you to watch more of the CEO Forum, Building More Civil and Just Society series at the Conference Board. Take care and be well. And thanks again, Darren.